The laugh track is the most deceitful sound in the world. It is a recorded loop of joy, preserved on magnetic tape, played over and over again to convince you that everything is funny. And for 15 years, no one triggered that mechanical joy quite like Carol Wayne. Picture the scene. NBC Studios, Burbank, the set of The Tonight Show. The king of late night, Johnny Carson, is playing his sleazy character, Art Fern. He introduces the Matinee Lady, and out she walks. She is a caricature of desire drawn by a cartoonist with a shaky hand. Platinum blonde hair piled high like a cumulus cloud, a smile that spans the width of the screen, and a physique that defies the laws of engineering. The audience hoots. Johnny raises an eyebrow. Carol giggles, a high-pitched, breathless sound that signals to every man in America, I am beautiful, I am available, and I am not smart enough to hurt you. She was the perfect punchline. She was America's favorite dumb blonde. For a decade, she was the visual comfort food for a nation of insomniacs. Now, open your eyes to a different reality. The date is the 13th of January 1985. The location is the Bay of Santiago in Manzanillo, Mexico. The water is warm, shallow, and murky. There are no studio lights here. There is no applause sign. Drifting in the surf, bobbing aimlessly like a piece of discarded driftwood, is a human body. It is a female, approximately 42 years old. She is fully clothed. Her body is swollen, the cruel result of 3 days in the salt water. The platinum hair is matted with sand and seaweed. The face that launched a million laughs is now unrecognizable, erased by the elements and the decomposition process. This is Carol Wayne. She is a long way from Burbank. She is a long way from the safety of the Tea Time movie sketch, and the silence surrounding her body is heavier than any applause she ever received. How does the most recognizable sidekick in American television history end up floating face down in a Mexican bay, in water only 4 feet deep? The official report says accidental drowning, but the ocean does not keep secrets. Only people do. To understand why Carol Wayne died alone in a foreign sea, we have to understand that she didn't just drown in water. She drowned in a specific kind of Hollywood economics. She was an asset that had been depreciated, a commodity that had been used up, and a woman who had spent her entire life playing a character that eventually erased the human being underneath. To find the woman, we have to peel away the Matinee Lady. We have to go back to the beginning, before the silicone and the peroxide. We have to go back to Chicago. Carol Marie Wayne was born in 1942, and here is the first irony in a life defined by them. The dumb blonde was actually a genius of physical discipline. Before she was a pinup, Carol was a figure skater. Ice skating is not a sport for the vacuous. It requires a profound understanding of physics, velocity, and pain tolerance. It demands a type of mental sharpness that allows you to calculate the rotation of a jump while moving at high speed on a surface as hard as concrete. As a teenager, Carol was disciplined. She was sharp. She was an athlete who understood that if you fall, you break bones. But then, biology intervened. Puberty hit Carol Wayne with the force of a freight train. She didn't just grow up. She transformed into a hypersexualized ideal of mid-century femininity. Suddenly, no one cared about her axle jump. No one cared about her discipline or her wit. She learned the lesson that every beautiful woman of the 1950s and 60s was forced to memorize. Her intellect was a liability, but her silhouette was a currency. She realized that the market value of Carol the athlete was 0, but the market value of Carol the bombshell, that was infinite. So, she made a transaction. It was a cold, calculated business decision. She dyed her hair. She lowered her voice an octave. She widened her eyes. She learned to suppress her intelligence, to hide her sharpness behind a veil of feigned ignorance. She looked at the Hollywood machine and said, "You want a dumb blonde? I will sell you the best dumb blonde you have ever seen." It was a performance, A brilliant, sustained act of method acting that lasted for 20 years. But she forgot the most dangerous rule of the masquerade. If you wear the mask long enough, it begins to eat into your skin. She sold them the Matinee Lady to pay the rent. She didn't know that eventually, the Matinee Lady would become the only thing left, and Carol Wayne would be evicted from her own life. By the early 1970s, Carol Wayne had secured what every actor in Los Angeles would kill for: steady employment on the most powerful stage in America. But steady employment in Hollywood is often a synonym for a slow-motion trap. Her stage was the Art Fern's Tea Time movie sketch on The Tonight Show. It was a segment that became a cultural ritual, as reliable as the tides. Johnny Carson would don a cheap wig, a pencil-thin mustache, and a sleazy plaid suit to play Art Fern, the fast-talking, morally bankrupt host of a midday movie program. He was the chaotic energy, the verbal gymnast spinning plates. And Carol? She was the Matinee Lady. She didn't need a script. She barely needed a voice. Her job description was brutally simple. Walk on stage. Stand there. Breathe. The dynamic was a masterclass in the gender economics of the era. Carson was the intellect. Wayne was the object. He would make a double entendre, usually about the size of her chest, and she would respond with that signature giggle, a sound that was half child, half siren. It was a laugh designed to absolve the men in the audience of their own lechery. It said, "I don't get the joke, so it's okay for you to look." With Keasting, for over 100 appearances, this was her life. She was the highest paid extra in television history. But let's analyze the transaction taking place under those studio lights. Carol Wayne was not merely a sidekick, she was an accessory asset. In the corporate ledger of NBC, Johnny Carson was the primary product, the heavy machinery that drove the network's stock price. Carol was the chrome plating. She was there to make the machine look shinier, to catch the eye, to add a layer of superficial value to the main attraction. She played the role of the dumb blonde with the precision of a surgeon. She knew exactly when to widen her eyes. She knew exactly how long to hold the silence after a joke to let the audience's laughter crest. This wasn't stupidity. It was timing. It was the residual discipline of the ice skater translated into the medium of farce. However, the tragedy of the dumb blonde archetype is that it is a prison with invisible bars. The audience didn't see the woman who read philosophy backstage. They didn't see the devoted mother. They saw a living cartoon. And unlike a cartoon, which can be erased or redrawn, Carol could not scrub the Matinee Lady off her skin when the cameras stopped rolling. The fame she achieved was a specific, toxic variety. It was a fame devoid of respect. When people approached her in the grocery store or at gas stations in 1975, they didn't ask for her autograph with trembling hands. They made lewd jokes. They expected her to be the airhead. They treated her public persona as an invitation to familiarity. She had sold her dignity to buy a house in West Hollywood, and the mortgage payments were due every single day. This relationship with Johnny Carson was the defining axis of her existence. He was the kingmaker. In the hierarchy of 1970s Hollywood, Carson was not just a host, he was a monarch. A nod from him could launch a career, a cold shoulder could end one. For Carol, Carson was a benevolent dictator. He liked her, he found her reliable. He knew that when she walked on stage, the ratings ticked up, but it was a relationship built on a fundamental imbalance of power. He was the puppeteer, she was the marionette. He held the strings. As long as she danced, as long as she giggled, as long as she remained the eternal, ageless object of desire, she was allowed to stay in the castle. But marionettes are not allowed to age. They are not allowed to have bad days. And they are certainly not allowed to be smarter than the puppeteer. By the late 1970s, the trap had fully closed. Carol Wayne was trapped in the amber of her own success. She wanted to branch out. She wanted to act. She auditioned for dramatic roles. desperate to show the industry that there was a brain beneath the platinum wig. But the casting directors of Los Angeles are a cynical breed. When Carol Wayne walked into a room to read for a serious drama, they didn't see an actress. They saw Art Fern's assistant. They saw the punchline. They couldn't hire her to play a lawyer or a doctor because the moment the audience saw her face, they would instinctively wait for the laugh track. She was typecast, not just in a role, but in a biological category. She was the body. And bodies in Hollywood are subject to the cruelest law of economics: depreciation. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the culture began to shift. The sexual revolution was curdling into cynicism. The innocent, wide-eyed shtick of the matinee lady was beginning to feel antiquated. And Carol was getting older. She was approaching 40. In the real world, 40 is young. In the visual economy of television, where high-definition cameras scrutinize every pore and wrinkle, 40 is a crisis. She was still beautiful, undeniably so, but the dumb blonde act requires a certain suspension of disbelief that becomes harder to maintain with age. An airhead at 22 is charming, an airhead at 40 is tragic. The audience's laughter began to change frequency. It was no longer the laughter of attraction. It was edging toward the laughter of pity. Carol sensed the shift. She knew the ice she was skating on was getting thinner. She was heavily leveraged emotionally and financially on a single asset, her spot on The Tonight Show. It was her paycheck, her identity, and her social standing. She didn't know that in the executive offices of NBC, a decision was being made that would cut the strings for good. The king was getting tired. The format was changing. And in the new math of late-night television, the matinee lady was about to become a redundant line item. The velvet trap was comfortable, warm, and soft. But like all traps, it was designed to hold the prey until the hunter arrived to finish the job. The 1980s arrived in Los Angeles not as a dawn, but as a corporate takeover. The soft focus and shag carpets of the 70s were stripped away, replaced by hard angles, cocaine-fueled ambition, and a ruthless bottom-line mentality. In this new decade, loyalty was an outdated concept. The industry was no longer about art. It was about efficiency. And in the efficiency equations of NBC, Carol Wayne was about to become a remaindered integer. The catastrophe began in 1980. It started at the very top of the food chain. Johnny Carson, the undisputed monarch of late-night television, was tired. He had been carrying the network on his back for nearly 2 decades. He possessed absolute leverage, and he used it. He threatened to quit unless his workload was reduced. The network executives, terrified of losing their cash cow, capitulated. They agreed to shorten The Tonight Show from 90 minutes to 60 minutes. On paper, this looked like a simple scheduling adjustment. In reality, it was a massacre for the supporting cast. 30 minutes of airtime vanished overnight. In the economy of television, time is the only resource that matters. When the supply of minutes shrank, the demand for filler evaporated. The Art Fern sketches, once a staple of the show, were expensive to produce. They required sets, costumes, and time. In the leaner, faster, 60-minute format, there was no room for the sprawling, leisurely comedy of the matinee lady. The guillotine didn't fall with a shout. It fell with a silence. There was no dramatic firing scene. Johnny Carson didn't call Carol into his office to explain the situation. There was no severance package, no gold watch, no tearful farewell broadcast. The phone simply stopped ringing. This is the specific cruelty of the Hollywood soft fire. You are not told to leave. You are simply no longer invited to enter. For weeks, Carol waited. She checked her answering service. She called her agent. She kept her hair dyed platinum, her figure taut, waiting for the summons to Burbank. But the summons never came. She had been phased out. In the language of corporate restructuring, she was an obsolete asset. The machinery of The Tonight Show had been streamlined, and she was the excess weight that had been trimmed to improve the aerodynamics of the vehicle. The psychological impact of this erasure was catastrophic. Carol Wayne had not just lost a job, she had lost her context. For 15 years, she existed only in relation to Johnny Carson. Without him, she was a punchline without a setup. She was a moon that had lost its planet, cast adrift into a cold, dark orbit. She tried to pivot. She was a fighter, born of the discipline of the ice rink. She hit the pavement. She auditioned for commercials, sitcoms, and dramas. She walked into casting offices with a resume that included one of the most successful runs in television history, but the typecast trap slammed shut with violent force. The casting directors of 1981 and 1982 looked at her and saw a dinosaur. She was a relic of a bygone era of television. Worse, she was a joke. When she tried to read serious lines, the producers suppressed giggles. They couldn't see past the Matinee Lady. Her brand was so strong, so perfectly crafted, that it had obliterated her range. She had sold them the dumb blonde so effectively that they refused to believe she could be anything else. And then there was the issue of depreciation. Carol was entering her 40s. In the 1980s, the entertainment industry viewed a 40-year-old sex symbol with the same disdain a stockbroker views a crashing bond. Her value was based entirely on a specific type of youthful, naive sexuality. As she aged, that currency devalued rapidly. She was competing against girls 20 years her junior who were willing to do more for less. The income dried up. The residuals from old shows were pennies, not dollars. But the lifestyle of a Hollywood star is a hungry beast that demands constant feeding. Carol had lived according to the income of a star. She had the house in West Hollywood, the wardrobe, the car, the social obligations. She had no savings because she had operated under the assumption that the ride would never end. She believed in the loyalty of the king. She didn't realize that in a monarchy, the king's only loyalty is to the crown. By 1984, the situation had devolved from professional disappointment to financial ruin. She declared bankruptcy. It was a humiliating public admission of failure. The courts cataloged her life. Her assets were liquidated. The trappings of her stardom were stripped away, piece by piece. The contrast was agonizing. The woman who smiled on millions of television screens every night in reruns was, in reality, scrambling to pay for groceries. To cope with the terror of irrelevance and the shame of poverty, Carol turned to the anesthesia of the era. Alcohol and cocaine became her new companions. In the 1980s, cocaine was not just a drug, it was a status symbol and a confidence simulator. It made you feel like you were still on top of the world, even as the walls were crumbling around you. It provided a synthetic energy that mimicked the rush of performing, but cocaine is an expensive habit for a bankrupt woman. This drove Carol into the darker corners of the Los Angeles social scene. She began to rely on the kindness of wealthy men. She drifted through parties, a fading beauty looking for a lifeline. She became a fixture in the night. A woman who used to be someone. The predators of the city, the playboys, the hustlers, the fringe operators smelled her vulnerability. She was no longer the matinee lady protected by the shield of NBC. She was just Carol, broke and desperate. By the winter of 1984, she was spiraling. Her judgment, clouded by substances and panic, began to fracture. She was looking for a savior. She was looking for anyone who could offer her an escape from the crushing reality of her failed second act. She needed a vacation from her own life. She needed to go somewhere where nobody knew she was bankrupt, somewhere where she could just be a beautiful blonde on a beach again. It was in this state of fragility, broke, intoxicated, and desperate for validation that she connected with a man named Edward Durston. He was not a savior. He was a man with a shadow longer than the California coastline. But to a woman drowning in dry land, he looked like a raft. In the architecture of every Hollywood tragedy, there is often a shadow figure, a person who exists in the periphery of the frame, uncredited and often unnoticed until the final act. For Carol Wayne, As she spiraled through the chaotic winter of 1984, that figure was Edward Durston. To understand the sheer, suffocating dread that surrounds the final days of Carol Wayne, one must look at the man she chose as her companion. Edward Durston was not a celebrity. He was a car salesman, a man who moved money and metal in the high-end automotive markets of Los Angeles. He was wealthy, charismatic, and moved through the VIP sections of the city with the ease of a predator navigating a reef. But Edward Durston carried a resume that was written in invisible ink, a history that would make a homicide detective's blood run cold. 16 years earlier, on October 4th, 1969, Durston had been inside an apartment in West Hollywood. He was visiting a young woman named Diane Linkletter. Diane was the daughter of the beloved television host Art Linkletter, a man who represented wholesome American family values. That morning, Diane Linkletter plummeted from her 6th-story window to her death. The official story was a suicide triggered by LSD. Edward Durston told police he tried to grab her, to save her, but she slipped through his fingers. He was never charged. He was cleared of wrongdoing. He walked away from the tragedy as a witness. But in the superstitious, whisper-heavy corridors of Los Angeles, a dark question lingered. What are the statistical odds of one man being the last person to see 2 different famous women alive, 16 years apart? Durston was a dark companion. In the orbit of fading stars, men like Durston often appear. They offer excitement, financial stability, and a connection to the high life that the star is terrified of losing. For Carol, bankrupt and emotionally shattered, Durston likely looked like a stabilizer. He was a man who could pay the bill. He was a man who could take control. But control is a dangerous thing to surrender when you are vulnerable. In January of 1985, Carol and Durston decided to leave the pressures of Los Angeles behind. They booked a trip to Mexico. Their destination was Manzanillo, specifically the Las Hadas resort. This choice of location was laden with a cruel irony. Las Hadas was not just a hotel. It was a cinematic landmark. It was the location where the movie 10 had been filmed, the movie that turned Bo Derek into an international sex symbol. Carol Wayne was traveling to the very site that celebrated the new blonde bombshell, the woman who had effectively replaced her archetype in the cultural consciousness. She was walking onto a movie set where she was no longer the star, trying to recreate a fantasy life she could no longer afford. They arrived in Manzanillo on January 10th, 1985. The atmosphere should have been idyllic. Las Hadas is a surrealist dream of white stucco towers and cobblestone paths, a place designed to make the real world disappear. But the reality between Carol and Durston was far from a honeymoon. From the moment they landed, the air between them was thick with tension. Witnesses later reported seeing a couple that seemed out of sync. They were not lovers enjoying a sunset. They were 2 volatile chemical compounds trapped in a heat wave. The dynamic was classic noir, the aging beauty queen clinging to her dignity, and the wealthy, aggressive man who perhaps realized he had purchased a depreciated asset that came with too much emotional baggage. Carol was likely drinking to cope with the anxiety of the trip. Durston, a man used to getting his way, was likely losing patience. On the 3rd day of the trip, the tension snapped. We do not have a transcript of the argument. We do not know if it was about money, about jealousy, or about the crushing weight of their shared dysfunction, but we know the mechanics of what happened next. They were in the lobby of the Las Hadas resort. Voices were raised. The veneer of the happy couple cracked wide open in front of the hotel staff. And then, Edward Durston did something that defines the callousness of this tragedy. He checked out. He didn't just walk away to cool off. He formally ended the transaction. He packed his bags. He arranged for transportation to the airport, and he left Carol Wayne there. Consider the absolute terror of this situation. Carol was in a foreign country. She reportedly had no passport on her person. It is often rumored Durston had it, or it was locked away. She had no money. She had no credit cards that worked, remember. She was in the middle of bankruptcy proceedings, and she had no way home. The man who was supposed to be her protector had just severed the lifeline. He got in a taxi and headed for the tarmac, intending to fly back to the safety of Los Angeles, leaving the Matinee Lady stranded in the lobby of a Mexican hotel like unmatched luggage. This was the spiral, reaching its terminal velocity. Carol was now completely alone. The dumb blonde act that had made her famous was useless here. You cannot giggle your way out of being stranded in Manzanillo. You cannot charm a hotel manager into giving you a room when you have no means of payment. Witnesses stated that Carol appeared frantic. She was seen wandering the grounds of the resort, a ghost in paradise. She was disoriented, likely intoxicated, and consumed by a primal panic. The velvet trap of Hollywood had been replaced by the very real, very physical trap of isolation. She had spent 20 years being taken care of, first by the studio system, then by Johnny Carson, and finally by men like Durston. She had never learned the survival skills required for this moment. She was a bird born in a cage who had suddenly been thrown into the wild without the ability to fly or hunt. As the sun went down on January 10th, 1985, Carol Wayne was a woman erased. The industry had forgotten her, her lover had abandoned her, and the ocean was waiting just a few hundred yards away, dark and indifferent. She walked out into the night, perhaps looking for a place to sleep, perhaps looking for a friendly face, or perhaps just walking because standing still meant having to think about the ruin of her life. Edward Durston was in the air, flying back to America, leaving the chaos behind him. He would land in Los Angeles, return to his life, and wait for the news. He would once again be the man who walked away just before the curtain fell. Carol Wayne, meanwhile, was walking toward the tide. The ocean is the ultimate indifference. It does not care about ratings points. It does not care about billing order. It does not care that the object drifting in the surf was once the most recognized woman on American late-night television. On the morning of January 13th, 1985, a local fisherman in the Bay of Santiago spotted something bobbing in the shallow water. It wasn't far from the shore, perhaps 4 feet deep. At first glance, it looked like a bundle of discarded clothing. It was Carol Wayne. The discovery of the body was devoid of the glamour that had defined her life. She was fully clothed. She was not dressed for swimming. She was dressed for a walk. This detail alone transforms the narrative from a simple drowning into a forensic puzzle. Why would a woman who notoriously could not swim, a woman terrified of deep water, walk into the ocean fully dressed in the middle of the night? The mechanics of her death, according to the Mexican authorities, were simple: accidental drowning. But in the world of high-stakes tourism, simplicity is often a product of economics, not truth. Manzanillo in 1985 was a booming resort town. The last thing the local Chamber of Commerce needed was an American celebrity murder mystery, staining the white sands of Las Hadas. A drowning is a tragedy. A murder is a PR disaster. The case was closed, with the speed of a business transaction being finalized before the fiscal quarter ends. The autopsy, if one can call it that, was perfunctory. There were no bruises consistent with a struggle, no water in the lungs to suggest a violent fight for air, just the silence of a heart that stopped. But the real mystery was not in the water. It was at the airport. Edward Durston, the man who had brought her there, the man who had witnessed the spiral, was gone. He had checked out of the hotel. He had left her luggage behind in the lobby. He had left her behind. By the time the fisherman pulled Carol Wayne's body from the tide, Durston was already back in the United States, or well on his way. This is the darkest note in the chord. Whether or not Durston had a hand in her physical death is a matter of speculation that will never be resolved, but his moral culpability is absolute. He abandoned a woman in a state of crisis. He treated her not like a human being, but like a rental car that had broken down on the side of the road. He simply walked away and caught the next flight home. He was never charged. He was never seriously interrogated. Just as he had walked away from the window of Diane Linkletter's apartment 16 years earlier, he walked away from the beaches of Manzanillo. He was a ghost who moved through the tragedies of Hollywood women, leaving silence in his wake. Back in Los Angeles, the news broke. The reaction of the industry was a study in coldness. Johnny Carson, the man whose career Carol had decorated for 15 years, mentioned her death on The Tonight Show. It was brief, it was somber, and then, after the commercial break, the band played on. The machine did not stop. The show, quite literally, went on. There was no grand investigation launched by her powerful friends. There was no outcry from the Screen Actors Guild. Carol Wayne was dead, and the industry simply adjusted the ledger. She was a write-off. She was an asset that had been depreciated to zero, and now she was off the books. Her estate was a ruin. The bankruptcy courts were still picking through the debris of her life, even as she was being laid to rest. There was no fortune left to inherit. The only thing she left behind was the footage. And this is the final, haunting irony of Carol Wayne's existence. If you turn on a television today, somewhere on a nostalgia channel or a streaming service, you can still see her. She is there, trapped in the magnetic tape of 1974. She is standing next to Art Fern. She is wearing the low-cut dress. She is smiling that wide, impossible smile. She giggles, and the audience laughs. That laugh track will play forever. It is a loop of digital immortality. But the woman who produced that giggle, the athlete, the mother, the terrified soul who walked into the Mexican surf has been erased. The culture consumed the Matinee Lady and discarded Carol Wayne. She died as she lived, as a supporting character in someone else's movie, left alone on the set after the director shouted, "Cut," waiting for a ride home that never came. The tide pulled her out, but it was Hollywood that let her drown.